Okay, welcome back to the GM Academy. I am Jim McClure, and today's topic is going to be on the appropriate use of death. That's right, the appropriate way to use death. And we are really going to get deep into this discussion here today because death is something, of course, that comes up quite frequently within tabletop, but yet there's a lot of misconceptions about it. The primary thing to understand going into it is there is a purpose of death. Death is a tool in a GM's toolbox, not an inevitability of a game. So, we're going to jump right into it here, and the first thing we're going to look at is what is the purpose of having death in a game? Because there is a purpose. Again, it's a tool to be used, and I break it down to there are three reasons to use death in a game. First is to establish mortality. Second is the result of player action or inaction. And third is to tell a story. So if we break these down, the first one, establishing mortality. This is probably the most straightforward of the three, and it is to establish that within your world, death happens. And it doesn't just happen to NPCs, and it doesn't just happen to villains, it happens to PCs. Characters can die. And this is a mechanic, of course, that is used very strongly in what I call tabletop hard mode, or dungeon, your classic dungeon crawl situation, where we need to establish that death is what happens. It is perhaps the end of the story for them. And death is really good about establishing that there are real-world consequences for your character. Now, the second thing it does, which ties heavily into that, or the second reason to use death, is the result of player action or player inaction. And this is essentially, of course, heavily laden into combat as well as narrative reasons, and that is that the player's actions cause them to die. Your level 5 party said, you know what, we're going to go fight that level 20 dragon. Let's go for it. And, of course, stomp, and it's over and they dead. They chose actions which resulted in their death. Likewise, inaction. If the players are facing a high mortality situation, an assault on the town, and they are choosing not to actively defend themselves or not do it properly through their own inaction or their own misaction, they can cause their death. And using death as a tool to reinforce this point really forces to the players that their decisions have consequences to them, and sometimes the ultimate consequence. Now, the third option is to tell a story. And this is the hardest one to do right, but is really powerful when done correctly. And that is to use death as the finale of that player's character. To have the ultimate moment of realization and the ultimate execution of what their character is from a narrative standpoint, death can be the fantastic period to the end of the sentence that is their character. So, anytime that we're looking at characters and we're looking at death, what we want to look at is, does it establish mortality? Is it the result of player action or inaction? And does it tell a story? Those are the three key points. If death doesn't do one of those three, you want to seriously question why the death is occurring. Okay, so when we look at death, and we've established our three purposes of death, now we look at two very distinct play styles that will really influence the way death is used. And that is our tabletop hard mode and our modern narrative style. And just to clarify, when I refer to tabletop hard mode, what we're talking about is the old school dungeon crawl. Characters get as far as they can, collect as much loot as they can, level up as much as they can before something finally brings them down. It's sort of the old school way to play, which of course still a lot of people play, and it is a play style. Another play style is our heavy narrative-based game, what we call modern tabletop playing. It's about community telling a story together more than it is about necessarily success or conquest, which again is a play style. And each of these two handles death a little bit differently. We start with our tabletop hard mode. The number one thing about using death in tabletop hard mode, and it is quite frequent in this style of play, but it has to seem fair to the players. It can't be undeserved. It can't be unjustified. It has to seem fair to them. Because if it's not fair, then everything they've done up to this point has been pointless. All of the dodging the traps, all of the fighting the monsters, everything like that, if it's not fair, then it meant nothing. And to tie into that fairness, there needs to be the consistent enforcement of rules to establish this. And that is playing the game by the book or playing with pre-established, here's our homebrew rules, here's what we're changing on it. Because if there are inconsistencies within the rules, it immediately breaks that sense of fairness. It's, well, this time it happened this way, and this time it happened this way, and I died when it happened this way. That's unfair to the player. Everything about doing the hard mode is how far we can get, how far we can push, how much we can do within the established set of rules. So you have to have death seem fair, and you have to have the consistent enforcement of the rules. Now, in our other mode, we have, which is our narrative, our modern tabletop, and this takes a complete different approach to death. It can still use many of the aspects in tabletop hard mode, but one of the key things is they're looking for it to tell the story better. So, it needs to happen at an appropriate time for the characters. Death should happen at a certain time. At the end of this video, of course, we're going to talk about some advice and ways to make that happen. But death can't just occur on a random encounter to a narrative player, to a narrative play style. It doesn't work. It just brings them down because it's something that's not heroic, it's not good storytelling for them to die in that regard. So, the other thing it needs to do is fulfill the life of the character. This is the character's story. Again, they have a story arc. Each individual player has their own story arc, and we need to fulfill that character's life, which means when the big event happens, they need to die, doing something heroic, rescuing people. They need to die fighting their nemesis. Something important needs to happen so that death can be the period at the end of that sentence to make a good, fluid story. Finally, it needs to have weighted impact. It cannot be meaningless in a narrative play style to narrative players. It has to be weighted. It has to feel like something big happened, like something heavy happened, and really brought them down. And that's vitally important. Okay, so now we look at ways to specifically handle and achieve these things that we talked about of the appropriate use of death within these different concepts. And the first one that we look at, which is really great for either narrative or tabletop hard mode, is escalating level of difficulty. What you do is you set up a situation throughout your campaign where there is increased risk for increased reward. From a traditional dungeon crawl, this is very straightforward in that you can set up a situation where here is a little bit of treasure and a trap in front of them. That's very obvious, very easy to handle. And they have the choice of going for the treasure and handling the trap. It's a fairly easy choice. Not a heavy reward, but a fairly easy choice. And then as they continue through the dungeon, the choices get heavier and heavier. There's more treasure. There's more dangerous traps. There's all of that. And every single time, there's a stepped up increase. And they have to choose whether they want to continue and take the greater risk, and take the greater risk for the greater reward. And then if they fail and they die, they only have themselves. They took the chance. They know they took the chance, and this time they failed. Sure, they'll get a chance next time with the next character, but it comes off, it's that sense of fairness. They made the choice to engage. They made the choice to take one step further, to get that much more treasure, to do that one more thing, and they ended up biting themselves for it. Escalating difficulty does very good job, but it has to be planned out from the beginning. If you hit them with a heavy encounter right from the beginning, first play session, it doesn't seem fair. It's just the GM throwing his weight around. Using escalating difficulty really goes a long way to achieve that sense of fairness. Another one of the other things that's used, which I do wish DMs would use this a lot more, and that is combats that have alternatives than one side dying. And what I mean by that is if we have a situation where the good guys, they're in town and there is a combat that's going on, let's say goblins are raiding the town to kidnap townspeople for whatever uses the goblins are going to use them for. And what happens is, naturally, this ends up in combat between the PCs and the villains, the goblins. But what we see with the way this encounter is structured, the goblins are interested in kidnapping villagers. So if they fight a PC and the goblins win, and the PCs lose the fight or are losing the fight, the goblins have no interest in continuing beating them until they're dead. They merely need to incapacitate them long enough to go and kidnap more villagers. So the lose condition of the combat is not death. It is still a loss from a narrative standpoint. They failed to stop the goblins, villagers got kidnapped, some of their important friends and all got kidnapped. Bad things happen, but the result was not death. So setting up combat in ways that doesn't have death as the ultimate result. Another one is, and it sort of ties closely into this, is characters just straight living through a loss. And that is a straight defeat in combat, one force against another, PCs losing or down. What you can do is have death not the end result, and you kind of have to use this sparse. And to use the example, I actually like Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back. If we all remember from the beginning of that movie, Luke is on Hoth, he goes out and explores for some reason, and gets knocked off his Yeti, and he has a random encounter with a Wampa, that big ice Yeti thing. And he loses that combat encounter. Straight, beast versus man, hero loses. But the Wampa didn't eat him. It drug him into the cave and gave him another opportunity to continue to live. And that is having characters live through a loss. There should be penalties for it. Either narrative or the stealing of loot or stealing of armor. There should be some consequences for it, but you don't always have to use death as the consequence. The other thing that you can really do, and of course this applies much more to narrative modern style games, and that is only running combat at high risk times. Of course, I'm a big Legend of the Five Rings player, and combat is incredibly lethal, yet I run narrative based games. And how I do that is within a 3 to 4 session campaign, I only actually have combat happen 1 or 2 times in 3 to 4 play sessions. Now, Legend of the Five Rings has social combat, has exploration, has a whole bunch of other things that make it a rich world to not have combat. But it is a very legitimate playstyle to only run combat in very high risk, very intense situations. And L5R, of course, by no means is the only system to do that. So, those are some options that I wanted to present you all as far as different ways that you can do death and do it correctly. Because if you really use incorrect death and you don't go into it with a purpose, again, death is a tool. It's a tool to be used. And if you use it incorrectly, what you're going to end up with is unhappy players. So, those are the different ways that we can handle death. Obviously, our different perspectives on death from a tabletop hard mode to a tabletop narrative mode. So, below, post your absolute favorite ways that you have used death, worst ways that you've encountered death, and any thoughts that you have on the video. As always, please subscribe to get the latest information from the GM Academy and our latest videos. Thank you very much. I'll see you all at the table.